Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Jen. I am a PhD student and a writer and also someone who works a 9 to 5, and I talk about being neurodivergent along with having a chronic illness and just kind of vlogs, routines, but also kind of chatty videos about where I'm at in life, particularly with probably my health, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I want to discuss a little bit more in detail my experiences with adrenal insufficiency, but also where I'm at now. I did do a 1-year update when I was diagnosed. I did a 2-year update. This year would have been my 3rd year and I didn't do one because I felt like I was in a little bit of a tricky place with it and I wasn't really in a position to talk about it and get feedback on it, to be honest. Like the bottom line here is that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, and also what works for my body doesn't always work for other people's. You know, we're all different and we all know that, but I think I was at an acute stage of trying to figure things out and needed to think things through. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I do have a small few notes in front of me just to keep me on track of what I'm, I suppose, going to be touching on and in what order, but otherwise it's very much my usual stream of consciousness conversation with myself that I hope you enjoy. It is a Sunday evening, it is nearly 8 o'clock and the sky is a beautiful colour, but the lighting is probably going to change throughout this, but I don't think anyone really minds or notices. So let's get started. First things first, what is adrenal insufficiency? If you're new to this, if you're not new to this, or you have adrenal insufficiency yourself, I hope you won't get too bored listening. Essentially, adrenal insufficiency and Addison's disease are in a similar category, or the same category. Sometimes I refer to myself as having Addison's disease, even though I technically don't, just because it's also what medical professionals recognise first and foremost. But adrenal insufficiency, if you have the primary type, there's 3 types, primary, secondary, tertiary. If you have the primary type, means that your adrenal glands, that are triangle little hats that sit on top of your kidneys, they're absolutely tiny, considering what they do, have stopped producing usually 2 hormones, but one of them being cortisol. If you have secondary and tertiary, it means that the pituitary gland in your brain that tells your adrenal glands to keep moving and produce cortisol has that kind of communication line has stopped or been reduced or suppressed. There's lots of different reasons in which you can be secondary versus tertiary. Secondary, for example, you know, might be as a result of another condition you have this. Tertiary, if I understand it correctly, might be because you, for example, maybe you had adrenal cancer and you've had to have your adrenal glands removed. Things like that, or you've had cancer and it's impacted your pituitary. Something kind of slightly different. For me, I have secondary adrenal insufficiency. I am diagnosed since January 2023. I was unwell for 11 years before diagnosis, which doesn't typically happen in primary adrenal insufficiency, which is called Addison's disease, because I suppose the go down of your energy levels, your health is pretty sudden. And you're really, in all of these conditions, you're at prey of hoping that the medical professionals you meet know what they're doing. But I think particularly in primary, in that initial crisis, because if your body goes without cortisol for too long, you go into what is called an adrenal crisis, or if you have primary, an Addisonian crisis. And those are life-threatening and potentially fatal, which is part of the rigmarole speech you get given to you by your endocrinologist when you're diagnosed, is about how it's so serious, all of those things, which it absolutely is. But for me, because I had secondary, and they don't really know, I have unexplained secondary adrenal insufficiency. I have had a lot of MRIs to try and see if I had a tumour on my pituitary, which is a common cause of secondary. I don't, there's nothing there. And my endocrinologist is a little bit unsure of what's going on or why that would have happened. He's not sure if I've had, I suppose, if having repeated viruses in the years preceding those 11 years, which I did have. I had glandular fever and a few other terrible viruses and bacterial infections essentially weakened my system and suppressed my pituitary adrenal axis. Or if the issue is higher up, then my pituitary and is in my hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus talks to your pituitary, which talks to your adrenals. Likelihood is we won't ever know. However, I got steadily worse and worse over the course of 11 years. I'd have times where it wasn't too bad. My symptoms in terms of the crushing fatigue, muscle pains, bone deep pains, to be honest, were not as bad. But mostly, to be honest, it was pretty progressive fairly steadily. Like, it continued on and on. I think the moments in which it was easier to deal with were moments in my life, corresponded moments in my life that were not as stressful, to be honest. Which would make absolute sense because there was less pressure on my body to produce cortisol. However, you know, by the time I reached January 2023, and certainly the end of 2022, I was on death's door, quite literally. It was very serious, and it was a very difficult time that I don't think I've properly processed, because I don't really know how to process it when I'm still in it, if that makes sense. I think anyone who has a chronic illness will understand that. You're trying to like process medical trauma that's happened to you whilst receiving new medical trauma. I don't know. Essentially, I suppose where I'm at with it now versus where I was is kind of the crux of this video. For me, I suppose 2023, my baseline cortisol levels there was some natural cortisol present. If you're primary adrenal insufficiency, you tend to have absolutely none. Your adrenals tend to just, you know, give up the ghost, as my mom would say. Or you like, it's generally very low, to none. Whereas, because that's autoimmune in nature, is generally the reason that happens. For secondary, however, because of the myriad of reasons it can happen, you might still produce some natural cortisol. It just is insufficient to keep you alive. The best way for testing this is to do an 8 a.m. cortisol test. That's how I was diagnosed. Well, that's how I was queried about having adrenal insufficiency. I was then asked to do a long synaption test. It's SYN, ACTHEN. So it's synthetic ACTH test. ACTH is the hormone the precursor to cortisol. And essentially it's a test that you can do a short version and a long version. Essentially your baseline cortisol levels are taken. You're then injected with a synthetic amount of ACTH, and then your blood levels of cortisol are taken around every, I can't remember with the long one, was it every half an hour or every 20 minutes or longer? Genuinely, I'm not sure. I think I was barely conscious throughout the long one. And that's when I was diagnosed, was when I got those results of being very low. My cortisol was extremely low. There was some present, but certainly not a sufficient amount to live. And then, of course, what do you do when you're diagnosed? You get prescribed steroids. You get prescribed synthetic cortisol, really. That can come in a few different forms. There's a few different types of steroids. Generally, the type that tends to be prescribed first, I think, or particularly in Ireland, is hydrocortisone. Hydrocortisone is fast acting, I suppose, and that's why they tend to prefer it. I think anyway, my endocrinologist certainly prefers hydrocortisone to any other steroid alternative because it's fast acting. So if you need to take it and you are starting to feel unwell, it's going to hit sooner. But also if you take too much, for example, it's out of your system faster. So 2023 was a lot about learning what my body considered stress. This is key because of a thing called stress dosing. There is no baseline amount of hydrocortisone that works perfectly for every human. I think, you know, it makes sense, like every single human, everyone handles stress differently, interprets stress differently. Everyone handles viruses, illnesses, family tragedies, accidents, all those things differently. So it would make sense that how much your body would absorb of hydrocortisone would change. There's certainly theories, and I don't even know if they're theories so much as facts, that, you know, people's metabolisms highly impact their absorption of the medication, also depending on if you are, you know, someone who's larger, someone who carries more muscle, someone who's younger, older. All of these factors skew everything. And I was more or less not told any of that. I was told that the big fear was about not taking too much, because you could end up with the opposite of adrenal insufficiency, well, kind of the opposite, which is Cushing's. Cushing's then causes, one of the symptoms of Cushing's can be having like a fatty hump on your back and weight gain and things. And I was constantly checking my back. I was constantly weighing myself in that first year and trying not to, because naturally going on steroids causes water retention. And also, if your body's been in fight or flight for like 11 years, I think it stabilizes a little bit. The reality was that I was 29. Was I 29? 28? No, 29, I think, 28. I don't know. But I basically didn't really know what my adult body was meant to look like at that time. So 2023 meant learning a lot about what I considered stress, how my body tolerated stress, what was water retention, what was weight gain, and what was health. Versus, because actively there was also an element of having a lot more muscle because I could walk and exercise. And also learning to balance all of those things whilst being autistic. I have ADHD as well, but I think being autistic is particularly poignant to Addison's disease or adrenal insufficiency, because in reality, how I interpret stress is so impacted by my environment, my sensory environment, my ability to socialize for long periods of time, the amount of masking I do on an everyday basis. All of those things are incredibly difficult. So what I would consider stressful, somebody else mightn't, which means if you are experiencing an acute form of stress, or like, for example, an illness, you do need to do sick day dosing, which is taking extra steroids, really, because I guess what you've been taking every other day has been to keep your body on a baseline, and then if you're suddenly fighting an illness or fighting an acute stress and trying to stay upright, your body obviously requires more. So 2023 was, I find 2023 a hard year to talk about, because, and I made videos at the time and I cannot watch them back. It was a hard year. It was a good year as well, which is hard. To kind of marry the two in my head. I like when things are either good or bad rather than being both, but I felt as though 2023, having a diagnosis, was life-changing in the sense that it was revolutionary to be able to get up and breathe, in the day, and not feel like you're kind of dragging this corpse-like body around with you at all times, going through the motions of feeling emotion because you can't allocate energy to it. However, it was incredibly difficult because of the amount of mental energy it took to manage my steroids and understand myself in relation to my brain. And to learn this new body with more weight, more muscle, more life, actually. And I don't think I realised that it was having more life. I think I saw it as having more pounds, which obviously if you grow up being conscious of your body in any way for whatever reason, which a lot of people my age are, given we were the America's Next Top Model era of kids watching that, having a rapid change in your body in any way, it's very hard to interpret that positively, even if you know the reason it's positive. So all that being said, 2023 was a difficult year. However, by the end of 2023, I think I had learned a lot about myself, a lot about how to balance myself. I had started a new job. I'd moved to Dublin. I was doing well for all intents and purposes. And I think my medication dose was much more consistent because I was having a lot less fluctuations in my body. However, in March 2024, I did experience an adrenal crisis, which was incredibly scary. Well, it would have been scary at the time if I felt anything. At the time of going through it, and I have a video on it, I think I have 2 videos on it. When I was going through it, I just didn't feel anything at all, which is part and parcel of it. An adrenal crisis is particularly dangerous because cortisol is linked to your electrolytes, and a large part of needing to be hospitalised is to get a rapid injection of usually 100 milligrams of hydrocortisone, but also generally needing huge amount of fluids in the body to restore an equilibrium with your potassium, magnesium and things like that, and your salt levels, and it's because of those electrolyte imbalances that your cognition goes in the moment. So it was very hard for me to really care about anything. But that did happen, and that really did set me back, I think, quite a while, because number one, you have to, you've come out of an acutely stressful near-death scenario, so your body then has to taper back down to its normal level of steroid to get through the day. But it's shook. You're shook, to be honest. And that happened when we started moving into April and May with that year, when it was quite warm, and I found I was sweating excessively, like huge amounts of sweat, which was really, really difficult to maintain my electrolytes. So I felt I had a huge amount of muscle weakness. So 2024 felt like I took some steps back, to be honest. But I don't even know if I did take steps back so much as I hadn't made as much progress as I had hoped in the first place, which is fine and fair. But still, still very difficult. 2025, though, was a pretty solid year, I think. No big things happened, no adrenal crisis happened, no major illnesses happened, and I could really stabilise. I also started going to the gym in January 2025. Prior to that, I've always loved exercise, but prior to that, it simply wasn't possible because my muscles gave out, or a small amount of exercise required me to updose because my body would consider it was such a stress. So 2025 was pretty good, to be honest. And now we're in May 2026 when things are still pretty good. I had a minor setback in December 2025 when I got strep throat. And that was difficult, and I feel like that took me a while to come out of, to be honest. But overall, 2024 felt like the last time things were extremely hard. Instead, in 2025 and 2026 so far, I've had pockets of hard, but not a consistent narrative of hard. So I suppose realistically where I'm at now is when I moved back to Dublin in 2023, my endocrinologist had been in Cork. I'm from Kerry, and the neighbouring county, Cork, is where my endocrinologist was. She said that it made sense, obviously, to have an endocrinologist in Dublin. I was referred to an endocrinologist in Dublin, and I got on great with him. He's still my endocrinologist. He's great. But basically, he wanted to do his own tests and his own synaptin tests, but he did a short synaptin test because a long synaptin test was very much more, I suppose, diagnostic in nature, whereas he wanted to see actually where my baseline was by 2020. Realistically, I think I saw him in the end of 2023. And at that point, I would have been on steroids for 11 months-ish, and he wanted to see where the level of recovery was. So the results came back. I do this thing every couple of months. I go to the pituitary investigation unit, which I just love that that's the name of it. I go there and I have a short synaptin test. My baseline cortisol is taken, blah, blah, blah. My electrolytes are checked, my levels, everything. And generally also, I have my other pituitary axes tested. Your pituitary doesn't just cover your adrenal pathway, it also covers your thyroid, your sex hormones, growth hormones, things like that. So, if you have a fault in one of those areas, sometimes a lot of people will have a fault in another. Thankfully, I've been very lucky not to have that issue come up, thank God. But essentially, I had my tests done at the end of 2023 and got my results in early 2024, just before my crisis. And my results were still pretty bad, to be honest. They had shown an actual drop from when I was first diagnosed. So when I was first diagnosed in January 2023, those blood results were from November 2022. So between the kind of year, between this year when you have before diagnosis to a year diagnosed, my results had actually nosedived a lot. My natural cortisol that I had fell off a cliff. I found this really disappointing, which my endocrinologist was like, calm down, it's not that surprising. He felt that it was fair because my body had been in fight or flight for such a long time that it was reasonable to allow my body time to, I suppose, essentially not feel like it's running on survival mode, and he did say, he was like, if you have been driving a car without any gas in it for a long time, or a very little amount of gas in it, you're probably pressing harder on the accelerator to get it to go anywhere, whereas suddenly when you have a full tank, you can let off the accelerator a little bit. He thought that this was my body letting off the accelerator, really. But he still wanted to monitor and see where I am to see if I was continuing to get worse over time. 2024 was a hazy one in terms of my results, because my results were very much skewed by having that adrenal crisis. But by the end of 2024, so I had the tests again, saw him in like early 2025. So we're kind of looking at every year, I guess, of having these tests. They showed no improvement. They didn't get any worse, but they showed no improvement. So that was okay. I was happy they weren't getting worse, but he did imagine that if there was any improvement to have happened, it was unlikely to be, I suppose, consistent after having an adrenal crisis that floored me so heavily. So he said essentially not to worry about it, and we'd do them again in July 2025. And I said, that's great, no problem. Even though he had been very clear to me that looking for improvement in your natural cortisol can happen for some people. It does not happen for many. It doesn't happen for a lot of people. He said for some people, their function continues to decline until they are fully reliant on steroids for life. Or some people's bodies, if their baseline is fairly healthy and their reasons for having adrenal insufficiency align with this, if the body relaxes enough to not be in constant survival mode, then sometimes you do start to produce some natural cortisol again, where you can then reduce the steroids you're taking. And that was all cool with me, but it honestly felt pretty theoretical, because I was just like, certainly in 2024 after the adrenal crisis, I felt so dead inside and so sore in my muscles and tired and weary. And like at this time I was starting my PhD and trying to keep my 9-to-5 job and all of those things, and I just felt so dead that the concept of recovery was just, it was almost something I was like entertaining for him. And I did, you know, at the end of the day, his major area of interest in endocrinology is the pituitary, which I think is interesting, because the previous endocrinologist I had's major area of interest was around diabetes and insulin production and things. That was why I'd initially been sent to her, because one of my first flags of adrenal insufficiency was having incredibly low blood sugars. So his area of interest, he's obviously seen enough people to know what's going on. And yeah, so I said I'd give it a go, and then in July 2025 I went to see him after having my bloods in the pituitary investigation unit done a few weeks previously, and he was thrilled. He was over the moon, because he said that it was a steady upswing in my results. So my body had started kicking in a little bit. To me, this made sense. On a feeling level, between 2024, which was a challenging year, and then into 2025, things were markedly different. My resilience level to stress was much higher. And this was not because I was taking any more steroids, it just felt like something in me calmed down. I was able to handle illnesses less. I was getting illnesses less, able to handle them more, like colds and flus and things. Nothing seemed to really floor me as much. I'd have blips, but they were definitely blips, not the narrative of how I was. So I was hopeful that there'd be some kind of upswing, but I wasn't gonna, set my emotions on it and get disappointed if nothing had happened. But he was thrilled. So essentially, I suppose, from diagnosis to then about a year in, things had dipped. And then I suppose if we're looking at, they kind of plateaued then about another year. And then in 2025, things have started to go up. They weren't dramatically better. Like, he was very clear to me. I think I got excited for like a minute, and he was like, calm down, you'll still die without steroids, which was great. Good reminder. And he said, at the end of the day, though, this is a positive indicator of what can happen. And then we began the conversation about tapering. Oh, and tapering, the word tapering freaks me out a little bit, because I'd read so much about it on the forums and seeing people taper and seeing how hard tapering is. And I'd heard a lot of horror stories about how difficult it is to taper and all of those things. But the possibilities kind of felt really worth exploring. Like if, for example, I was going to have a life on steroids, I would love, for my own health, for the side effects, for all of that, if I was on the least amount possible, to survive, that I didn't need to be on huge doses. And naturally, I suppose the idea is that if your body starts to wake up a little bit, your pituitary is waking up and it's releasing a little bit more natural cortisol into the body, the idea is that you would reduce your steroids alongside that, so that reduction slowly and steadily indicates to your body that it needs to start producing more natural cortisol. So yeah, that's kind of, I suppose, where we were at that point. He did talk to me about how difficult tapering was. He did say that it was going to have to be very strongly based on how I felt, which I do appreciate. I appreciate that he trusted me that much, to be honest. Not a lot of doctors, I think, do. I think a lot of doctors don't set much store by your opinion of your personal, like how you feel internally. However, he had said, I think you need to really pay attention as you reduce your dose over the next 9 months, which was the next interval we decided on how you're feeling. He said, you're the one who will be able to understand if a new headache you're feeling is a tapering headache that you can tolerate until it's a side effect that wears off, or if it's actually a warning sign that your cortisol is getting too low. And he did warn me and say, you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And I was really thrilled in the moment, but then like kind of concerned about actually the practicalities of doing it. The way we had it set up was, and he said all of this was based on how I felt, and I could stay on as many steroids as I needed. He didn't say that. He said I could stay on the amount of steroids I'm currently on if I felt unwell, because he was like, you're still doing a PhD, you still have a stressful job, things are stressful, so you need to also take all of that into account. So he basically said, why don't we, over the next 9 months, try to get down 2.5 milligrams a day. Make that 2.5 milligrams be our consistent drop, which sounds, I think if you're someone who hasn't taken steroids before or doesn't have a condition like adrenal insufficiency or Addison's disease, 2.5, going down by 2.5 milligrams over 9 months probably sounds a little bit ludicrous because it's such a small amount. But I knew straight away, I was like, that's gonna require consistency in my life, that's gonna require me monitoring myself constantly, and it means I then will also have to start to be really aware of what I can tolerate in terms of symptoms and what I can't. So I agreed to try, and that's what I was doing from July 2025 until April 26 is when I had my appointment with him. I did have the bloods done in, I think, March 2026. There wasn't a long time between my bloods and my synaptin test this time and my consultation with him. I had told everyone, I was like, I'm not going to improve that much this time. I don't feel that much different. Between 2024 and 2025, I felt markedly much better. I felt markedly much more stable and like consistent in my body. Between 25 and 26, I didn't feel that same change. So I was pretty sure I wasn't going to be doing that much better. I had managed to get down that 2.5 milligrams more or less most days, probably like 4 or 5 days a week, but certainly not every day. But even that reduction, I won't lie, I didn't find that hard. I didn't think that was hard. It was a little bit tiring at the start, but it certainly wasn't enough to kind of stop me going to work or anything. So in my head, I kind of had this idea that tapering was actually fine and like maybe I'm just really good at it, which is obviously not the case. But anyway, so I went back to him and he was thrilled again, which was nice. And he said that my results had taken a big upswing. So I was really surprised because I told him I didn't feel that much different. He said that he thought that made sense. He said that from my results from 24 to 25, basically I had been running on empty that anything would have felt dramatically different, whereas he said now you're running on stable, so now you're just going to become more solid in your stable, and a lot of the benefits of this are actually going to be happening in ways that aren't immediately noticeable, which did make sense when he said it like that. And here we are now with the goal of tapering round 2. After finding round 1, I don't want to say easy, but certainly not that taxing. So he asked me how I felt about the idea of going around down another 2.5 milligrams. I'm purposely not saying the numbers, by the way, because everyone is on hugely different doses of hydrocortisone or any kind of steroid they're on. I don't think it's helpful for me to come in and tell you what I do, because I have learned from reading what other people do and trying it doesn't work the same way as trying to figure it out for yourself and your own body, which I know is deeply unhelpful to say. But yeah, he asked me how I felt about the idea of going down another 2.5 milligrams, and I was like, this time I was buzzing. I was like, absolutely. Once again, he brought me back down to earth very quickly and did say, oh well, just remember you'll die without your steroids, you're still not recovered, blah 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 blah, and I'm a good way off recovered. And I was like, okay, fine. Fair enough. He did say that he imagines that, he said some people only make so much progress where they, will still have gotten their steroids down to the bare minimum, but they might still require a small dose in the mornings to survive, or they might require dosing for stressful days. I thought that was fine. I would not care if I had to take a small amount every morning and I was otherwise able to produce enough cortisol to survive. To me, that would be the dream. So any improvement is worth it. So I felt really, really positive. I felt really overwhelmed after I felt positive, after I left the office. This usually happens after I ring my parents and explain everything, and then I absorb other people's emotions. I need to let myself sit with the thing by myself for longer, but when it comes to my health, my family are so invested in it that I always feel like I need to ring them straight away. Yeah, I started to feel pretty overwhelmed with the idea of tapering and also the results itself, to be honest, this is going to sound daft to explain, because I should just be happy that my body is producing some natural cortisol, but instead, because my results had improved so much, I felt really, really thrown. And I felt as though no one said this, no doctor said this. This is obviously how I am. I felt as though I must have been making it up the whole time, actually, if I'm able to get better. Or maybe I was creating the stress to give myself this condition, actually. And I could have been better all along. So instead of being thrilled that I could taper, it almost became annoyed that I hadn't tapered sooner, that I hadn't done better at this. That speaks to my personality a lot, and honestly, that's a conversation for my therapist. But once that wore off, I did think, great, let's start tapering the next 2.5 milligrams. Did I consider the fact that I had not gotten down the original 2.5 milligrams, that in first taper, completely 7 days a week? No, I didn't. So instead, I dropped another 2.5 milligrams without considering that. And I felt so bad, so bad. I say so bad, this was last week. This was the week before last. I have not felt fatigue like that in a long time. Really, really have not. I also found it so hard to emote, like my ability to even construct my face into a feeling, gone. I was crying. I took a clip and I'm not going to include it because I think it's nonsensical. But it was actually me talking to the camera, trying to explain my level of why my upset right now was valid, but it was actually outsized as a reaction because I was experiencing, instead of tapering and having a normal tapering reaction, I'd driven myself to a low cortisol entirely. Because essentially I was trying to drop 5 milligrams hard and fast. That's far too fast. Instead, I really, really should have focused immediately on getting that first taper of 2.5 7 days a week. But I think partially because I was so thrilled at the idea of being off steroids, but more so because I felt like I must have been making all of this up, like almost gaslighting myself into believing I had this condition. I felt like, okay, well, I should taper faster. I know none of that makes sense and it's very hard to explain, but there was something very, very grounding about being diagnosed with adrenal insufficiency after being unwell for so many years and after being essentially fobbed off by doctors. I felt like, oh, wow, there's actually something wrong and they found it. And actually, it explains the fatigue, the exhaustion, everything. Like, it was revolutionary not to consider myself a liar, and lying to myself as well included. That the idea that actually I can reverse all of that, instead of being amazing, actually felt like, okay, so did I make it up in the first place? So I think that led me to try and taper too fast, to be honest. And now, where I'm at now, I am on my first week. I think I've just completed my first week of that 7-day a week 2.5 drop, and it was actually fine. It's actually absolutely fine, but that initial taper too hard was like, I was so emotional whilst also feeling absolutely nothing. Like, I could not emote to care about anything, but if someone misspoke to me vaguely, I was in floods of tears and nothing had ever hurt more. It was extremely dramatic in terms of a hormonal kind of swing, to be honest. So I'm going to stay stable on this new level of slightly reduced for a couple of weeks and potentially into the end of June, because I'll be traveling and it'll be warm. And then from the end of June, start of July, look at tapering from there and see where I'm at. This is all very contingent on how stressful life is, how stressful my job is, how warm it is, and how much I'm sweating. And then I'm due to see him again in January 2027, which will be strange because then I'll have been diagnosed 4 years and we will have results from November 22 to all the way to January 27. So if there was another upswing, that would be amazing. I think it will scare me a little bit to start dropping quite low on steroids. But more than being afraid, I think once I move past this self-inflicted like shame about it, I'd be quite excited to try it, but I don't think I'll ever make the mistake of tapering so fast again. I've made countless mistakes in the adrenal insufficiency journey, all of which, I've documented some of them. If you've watched my old videos on adrenal insufficiency, you'll know I used to use worksheets throughout 23 and 24, where I had to monitor my every bloody breath nearly to understand what caused me stress and what didn't, and that honestly changed the game for me and was amazing. It was amazing when I didn't have to do that anymore. I think I'm going to have to create something similar for tapering, where I have to look at what impacts a taper when I shouldn't be tapering. For example, a particularly stressful day in work, when I've had night sweats, where I am on my period, all of these things which impact your natural cortisol levels so much, that is that the right moment to be dropping down. So I think those are things I'm going to have to start. The reason I used to use those worksheets before was because I needed them to make me consciously aware of what I was doing every day, because otherwise I don't have a permanency in my brain for like, oh, that was that day where the weather was bad, or I didn't get to eat as much, or I didn't drink that much water, or that was the day I also had a head cold, or my hay fever was really bad, or I will forget all of these factors because each day just blends and blends and blends. So I think I need one for tapering where I'm making myself aware of those daily fluctuations as well. Hopefully not as an intense a worksheet, but I'll get back designing those and doing those. At least I'll have plenty of time, because if my results have gone up again by January 27, I'll be doing tapering round 3. If I am ever to be on no steroids or on the really low amount of steroids, it'll probably be 2029 or 2030 maybe. It really depends on how my body reacts, and my endocrinologist was very clear that there's no point in rushing into this because the benefit is massive, but if we rush into it, you can often shock the body to stop producing cortisol altogether, and then you've backtracked 1,000 steps. So there is no point in rushing this. And realistically, if I manage to get on whatever is the lowest amount of steroids for me, that will have benefits for the next few decades of my life. So if I give a next kind of hard 3 years, it'll be worth it. I am incredibly sad and overwhelmed about one aspect of it, which is another conversation for my therapist, but I'm going to mention it here, is that things had just felt stable with adrenal insufficiency in 25 and 26, and realistically it's not even stable for a year probably, and now I have to change things again, and that feels really, really, really sad. Like, that really overwhelms me to think about, because, you know, I gave the 11 years prior to diagnosis, which was my entire 20s, my late teens, feeling less than alive. And then I've had a year, maybe in a year and a month or two, of stability. And that's just, now I have to do this journey for potentially 3-4 years. And that really, that puts me at my mid-30s. I understand your mid-30s are still very young, but I don't know if I'll ever be okay with how much time I've lost to my health in general. I do have more going on than just adrenal insufficiency, some of which I'm not really in a position to talk about just yet, but I do think that's aggravating and frustrating, and I think more than anything makes me feel so sad. But anyway, I just wanted to mention it because I'm hopefully, like, I can't watch those videos from 2023 now. Maybe when I'm like 50 and 60, I'll look back on them and think she was great, because I know I certainly already look back on who I was in 2023 and what I survived and all of the years previous, and I just think, I look at the friendships I maintained and the studies I did and all of those things, and I just think she was fantastic. You know, she was fantastic and she was a force, and I hope someday I can look back at this version and think the same thing, but I can only do that if I document it. So thank you for giving me a space to do that. And I hope you liked this incredibly rambly video, and feel free to join me on my tapering journey. It'll be an up and down scale, I'm sure, but you know, we'll write it out and we'll see what happens. But yeah, for now, I will see you guys soon, and yeah, thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate it.